So, this is the final phase of this part of the project. This is for Lance's class. Um, so what I'm going to do is kind of do a recap of what I was doing, kind of touch on the presentation I did in class because that would be missing from anybody who's coming into the project on the run. I've been kind of building on a project or a presentation that I started. I chose Surrealism to study and do a presentation for the class. And so I worked with Joyce Mansour, and I'm not gonna cover her poetry. In fact, in this series of tapes, all I'm going to do is touch on Carlos Williams, because I found he probably, out of the selected readings, had the most to offer as far as what I'm doing with my work. First thing I did was define surrealism, and surrealism, because I believe in standard definition if we're communicating. It's fine if you want to say this means this to me. But as far as doing an academic study, I think we have to kind of go to find some definition that we can all say this is the standard definition that's at play, and this is how we're going to use it so we can actually open up communication. So first thing I'm going to do is do that. So surrealism is a style in literature, and actually began in literature, moved on to painting that stresses the subconscious or a non-rational aspect of man's existence. Surrealism, which means above, beneath, and beyond reality, was first applied to a movement that sprang up in France at the end of World War I, influenced by Freudianism and horrified by the brutality of war. Some painters and writers presented imagery by stressing chance effects in disorderly array, much like a random sequence of events or recollections experienced in dreams. Surrealism, which has been largely confined to French writers and artists, was a development from Dadaism. Now, Dadaism are techniques from the 20th century group in Paris which emphasized and exploited incongruous, bizarre, and accidental effects in their writing and paintings, challenged and denied established traditions and canons of art, morality, customs, and thought, a form of conscious madness that later developed into surrealism. Surrealism, then, is that and our course is on affect, and a lot of people misunderstand the difference between affect and effect because they're so similar. So effect would be the change that comes about from something, from an instigating source, where affect is the influence. So I found surrealism had a lot of effect, but it had a great affect as far as that's what surrealists were wanting to do. So I did a study, and it went through all the different things that surrealists were after. But what I found most interesting was that surrealists considered themselves revolutionaries, and so they were after effecting change. And so they felt that poetry was the weapon of choice, and that through poetry they could have a playful, poetic, free-spirited, to be in love with love and dreams and the marvelous, and the rich and extravagant and anti-rationality, and the most outrageous humor, and that would support the revolt and the revolution. And so they believed in unequivocal seriousness, as serious as pleasure. So what they intended to do was to reshape the way everybody related to things and to create an affect with their poetry that made people reconsider poetry, freedom, love, and create a revolution. There was success in the revolution, and a lot of this is from their original manifesto, and it's one of the few poetic movements that actually has a manifesto. I've had conversations with people about surrealism and how they feel surrealism has ceased and it was lost in a time. But there are still surrealists out there. They're very politically engaged, and they don't believe in authoritarian institutions. So their statement was, or their argument goes kind of like this: if civilization persists on its disastrous path, denying dreams, degrading language, shackling love, destroying nature, perpetuating racism, glorifying authoritarian institutions such as family, church, state, patriarchy, military, and so-called free market, and reducing all that exists to the status of disposable commodities, the surely devastation is in store not only for us but for all life on this planet. Effective ways out are accessible to all, and they are poetry, freedom, love, and revolution. So that was their main thrust, the whole main reason why they did what they did and why they used poetry, because they felt poetry kind of freed the mind and created a Nietzschean sense of free play. Some of the successes of the revolution, I found this was most interesting, is that, and I'll post my presentation notes as well if you want to see like all the detailed notes. But some of the successes of the revolution was that they believed thought had no sex. And during their time, by the way, which would be for the first movement, was 1924 to 1929. And during their time, they were considered so subversive that subversive groups didn't want to do anything, want anything to do with them. And interestingly enough, a lot of their subversive ideas are now considered mainstream. So they were kind of the progenitors of change, and through their actions and poetry and living the way they did, they actually did have an affect. Meaning they had influence. So they believed thought has no sex. So they didn't believe in genderfied, the brain was genderfied. They believed thought was accessible to everybody regardless of your gender. Let's see. They were anti-military, which is very mainstream now. There are people who are not necessarily anti-military as in peacekeeping, but they were very much anti-military, bearing in mind that they were around World War II. And they actually started World War I to World War II and continued on. They were anti-church, which seems to be very mainstream now. A lot of people they'll go to church for community, but they don't necessarily believe in the authority of the church or the authority of the military. They were anti-traditional family, so single mother, single father, homosexual marriages, so anything anti-traditional family, or anything traditional family, they were actually anti-traditional family. They just believed family should be family, whatever the makeup. They were anti-traditional free market. They were anti-racist. They were anti-classist. And these are all things that are now mainstream, but back then was the ideology had it so locked that all of that military, church, traditional family, traditional free market, racism, and classism were all just the norm. So they actually moved against the norm. They tended to recognize women as teachers, exemplars, and guides, and a lot of the male counterparts took the surname of their female companions, which back then would have been super unusual, but now there are a lot of men who actually do those things. Their ideal was not marriage, but family, but rather free unions and free spirits, and that's something you find people who now partner up and don't necessarily feel they have to ascribe to or answer to or get the blessing of a church or a state to be in a union. They believed in celebration of a child woman, and what that means is that perhaps childhood comes the closest to real life, and because when you're a child you haven't been taught to think according to society's dictates. And so they felt that women really harnessed that. So, and it wasn't that infantilized or helpless, but a proud, defiant, refusing to surrender with a child's boldness, curiosity, the spirit of adventure. So for them, those were the ideals, and they thought women really embodied that. And they even saw in the dichotomy of how women are presented as the Mary and the Magdalene. In the Magdalene, they actually celebrated the sorceress, the vamp, the succubus, the sphinx, any one of those, because they felt it was a radical alternative to the bourgeoisie Christian ideal of a good, selfless, husband-worshipping, submissive, ignorant, fearful, pious, hardworking, obedient wife and mother. So for them, the ideal woman was actually a free, wild, untamed woman at her most. And the men there were very much involved in the feminist movement. And in the beginning, they were not perfect, and every time they realized they got called on the carpet about their male chauvinism, they would actually evolve and try to change their way of thinking. So they actually they didn't have any use for it, and they refused the pro-offered maleness. So they didn't idealize soldier, politician, cop, gangster, banker, businessman, athlete, bureaucrat, or boss. And they were called traitors of their sex, and they rejected such masculine prerogatives as law and order, reason, logic, and championed so-called female virtues. So these are the men who were championing these virtues and vices, because they're considered vices at times, of intuition, impulsiveness, and passivity. They hailed hysteria, which the label was commonly tossed at women for their emotional upheavals that exceeded the boundaries of bourgeoisie propriety. But they thought that was a supreme means of expression. So now we know that if you actually internalize and you don't express yourself, that actually that's unhealthy. So what used to be considered a woman's space, and men who, were held up to this ideal that they would be stoic and not feeling, they actually were the first men as a bigger group to write against these things, and hence that's why they were subversive, because they idealized woman in all her many incarnations in literature and thought that she was exemplar of what human potential was when she was untamed, because she had embraced emotionality, and she was nurturing, but she also was kind and compassionate. And so they actually, men in this group actually held up women as the thing to be, as opposed to the white male standard patriarchy of the time. So that is the surrealism that I've been working with, and that's what started this entire project. So went out and I wrote some surrealist poetry, as has been posted, and from there I'm going to go through each of the different theories with surrealist ideas in mind, and talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to get into a little bit of Carlos Williams, and talk a little bit about that, and that should wrap up the first part of the project, at least for this semester. Larger project is upcoming, and then of course I'll still be going out interviewing people until the very bitter end, adding to it. It's going to be ongoing for the year, the interviewing people, and I might pop on every once in a while and write something and share it with you. So that's the theory of the surrealisms that I'm working with. Like I said, I will post my notes so that it's a little bit more in depth along with this video, so it's there for you to read, and feel free to respond. Thanks, bye.